Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, so I want you to picture a man standing outside a Clark Street saloon in Chicago. It's January 19th, 1897.
The dead of winter.
Exactly. The temperature's hovering right near zero, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan is just brutal. It's that kind of cold that physically hurts your lungs when you breathe.
Oh, absolutely. The kind of cold that can be lethal.
Right. And this man has just been physically thrown out into the snow by a bartender. He's dead drunk, completely penniless, and he's shivering violently because, well, he doesn't even have shoes on his feet.
Because he sold them.
Yeah. He sold his own shoes days ago for whiskey. And the last thing the bartender yelled at him before slamming the door was just a piece of advice. He told him to go jump into the lake and end it all.
And the grim reality of that moment is that he fully intended to take that advice.
He really did.
The whole trajectory of his life had basically narrowed down to that one freezing body of water.
Right. And he would have been the only one, which is just tragic. When I was looking into the historical context for this deep dive, the police records from Chicago that specific winter are just staggering.
They're horrifying.
Over 2,300 people committed suicide in a similar fashion.
Wow.
Yeah, 2,300. And the biographer we're drawing from today calls this exact moment the missing obituary.
I love that framing.
It's so powerful, right? Because if the night had gone the way it was statistically supposed to, the newspaper clipping the next morning would have just read, ragged bumfished out of Lake Michigan, body of drunken suicide lies in morgue awaiting identification.
That was the absolute statistical certainty of this guy's life at that point.
But that obituary was never published. Instead, that man, his name was Melvin E. Trotter, he survived the night. And he went on to become one of the most prolific, transformative figures in the history of American urban rescue.
Yeah, the turnaround is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
He ended up founding 67 rescue missions, influenced literal millions of lives, and, fundamentally rewrote the playbook on grassroots leadership.
Which is exactly why we are unpacking his life today. So we're pulling our insights from the official biography. It's called Mel Trotter, a biography written by Fred C. Zarfas.
And Zarfas is such a great source for this.
He really is, because he wasn't just some academic observing from afar, right? He was a former superintendent of the Mel Trotter mission himself.
Yeah, he understood the actual machinery that Trotter built. He was in the trenches.
Exactly. And for you listening, I want to sort of frame our mission for this deep dive. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, we expect precision.
Right, like an X-ray.
Exactly. You break an arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and we have a clear binary reality. It's broke or it's not broken, clean and comforting.
But when you step into the world of 19th century neurodevelopment and profound addiction, that X-ray machine is utterly useless.
It really is.
The diagnostic landscape just becomes entirely murky. When you're analyzing a human mind operating at the absolute limits of despair, that clean binary just completely falls apart.
Because you're looking at a paradox.
Exactly. You're looking at an organism that is simultaneously fighting desperately to survive while also actively orchestrating its own destruction. That's the paradox of severe addiction.
And it's the defining paradox of Mel Trotter's early life. So we really need to look at the genesis of that, right?
Let's get into it.
So Trotter was born on May 16th, 1870 in Orangeville, Illinois, and later his family moved to Polo, Illinois. And the generational shadow hanging over this household was incredibly heavy.
Yeah, his father, William, wasn't just like a casual drinker.
No, not at all.
He was a bartender and an habitual chronic alcoholic, so he literally served the poison for a living, and he consumed his own inventory.
And the environmental conditioning there, it cannot be overstated, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely not. From a modern psychological perspective, we know that children who grow up in households with active severe alcoholism are subjected to this constant state of hypervigilance.
Because the home is fundamentally unpredictable.
Right. But beyond the psychological toll, there's just the raw sensory immersion of it all. Mel grew up literally smelling of the saloon.
The scent of, stale beer and unwashed bodies?
Exactly. Cheap liquor was his baseline normal. The text even notes he would frequently skip school, the Little Red Schoolhouse on Division Street just to hang around his father's saloon.
And the gambling dens,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. The saloon was his actual classroom. That's where he learned how the world worked.
Which creates this really intense cognitive dissonance because of his mother. Emily Jane Lorch is this fascinating counterweight in his life.
She really is a vital part of the story.
The historical details the biography provides about her are just incredible. She grew up in Springfield, Illinois, and she was actually a childhood neighbor and playmate of Anna Herndon.
Right, and Anna's father was Abraham Lincoln's law partner.
Yeah, so she comes from this very rooted, historically significant Midwestern background. And she was a woman of just incredibly deep, resilient faith.
Which is such a contrast to the father.
Exactly. In the middle of this chaotic, alcohol-soaked home, she gives Mel this one specific psychological anchor. She teaches him a foundational childhood prayer.
But it's not just a generic bedtime prayer, is it?
No, it's a highly specific, almost prophetic verse. It goes, "In life's tempest, just remember, prayer will make the storm a calm."
That contrast between the parents is really the defining architecture of his early psyche. You have the father modeling this destructive addiction, providing both the genetic predisposition and the environment for it.
The total blueprint for alcoholism.
Right. And on the exact opposite end, you have the mother modeling an agonizing, relentless faith. She is planting this linguistic anchor deep into his subconscious.
The concept of a storm and a calm.
Exactly. She had zero control over her husband's drinking, and she would have no control over her son's eventual descent. But she was constructing a latent framework of grace.
She was giving him a vocabulary for rescue that he wouldn't even access for decades.
But he had to go through the tempest first, and he definitely went looking for it early.
He sure did. At 17, he leaves home for Freeport, Illinois. He's chafing under the restraints of his parents' house, which, makes sense.
It's entirely predictable for an adolescent trying to escape a volatile environment.
Right. So he takes up a trade as a barber. But the barbering was really just a front, or at least a secondary pursuit.
Yeah, his life was entirely consumed by horse racing, gambling, and drinking. He actually became known locally as the drunken barber.
The choice of the barbering profession in the late 19th century is actually quite telling, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Barbershops back then were these prime social hubs for men. They were intimately connected to the culture of gambling, sports talk, and drinking.
So while he had a legitimate trade, his daily environment was essentially just a continuation of his father's saloon.
Exactly. He boasted about knowing the pedigree of every racehorse in the country, and he lived in this state of wild oscillation.
Boom and bust.
Right. One day he'd be flushed with cash from a winning bet. The next day he'd be entirely broke, resorting to panhandling.
And this cycle, fueled by dopamine spikes from gambling and the chemical dependency of alcohol, became his rigid neurological loop for 10 hideous years.
10 years of just grinding addiction.
And this requires us to look honestly at the brutal reality of addiction treatment, or really, the total lack thereof in the 19th century.
It was the dark ages for mental health, truly.
Right. If you were struggling with what Mel was struggling with today, you'd have an entire medical and psychological infrastructure available.
Inpatient rehabs, cognitive behavioral therapy, medications to manage withdrawal.
A nuanced understanding of trauma responses. But back then, the medical community was flying entirely blind. Addiction was almost universally viewed as just a moral failing.
A weakness of character. The concept of addiction as a physiological disease that literally alters brain chemistry just did not exist in the mainstream medical consciousness.
Though Mel was experiencing these classic destructive cycles of severe dependency.
He would brace up, make earnest promises to do better, white-knuckle his way through a few days of sobriety, and then...
The physiological craving would just overpower his willpower.
Yeah, leading to an even more catastrophic relapse. And the interventions of the era really reflect this utter desperation and ignorance.
The sources mentioned a few specific interventions his family tried after he married a woman named Lottie. And Lottie is another deeply tragic figure here.
She thought she was marrying a respectable guy.
Yeah, the book notes that when Mel was sober, he was a highly lovable, considerate husband. But the disease always took the wheel. So they try to fix it. First, they try what is famously known in recovery circles as this geographic cure.
The geographic cure, it's a fascinating psychological phenomenon.
So they literally pack up and move to the country, 11 miles from the nearest saloon. They buy a horse and buggy. And for like 3 months, it actually appears to work.
But the geographic cure is built on the externalization of the problem. The addict convinces themselves that the city or the local saloons or the stressful job are the root causes of their misery.
Right. If they can just change their physical coordinates, they can leave the addiction behind in the old zip code. I always visualize the geographic cure like trying to fix a sinking ship by just moving the deck chairs around.
That's a great way to put it.
Or like trying to cure a deeply embedded computer virus by just going out and buying a new monitor. You plug the new monitor in, the screen looks totally different.
The desktop background is a beautiful country landscape.
Exactly. You think, great, the computer's fixed, but the underlying operating system is still entirely corrupted. The virus is still executing its code in the background.
And Mel, moving to the country, changed the scenery, but it didn't rewrite his corrupted neurological pathways. That craving was still gnawing at his vitals.
And when the inevitable relapse occurs after a geographic cure, it is often so much worse.
Oh, almost always. Because the illusion of control has been completely shattered. They eventually moved back to a city environment, Davenport, Iowa, and the situation just deteriorated rapidly.
And this is when the family turns to the medical interventions of the day. The text mentions they tried everything in the book, specifically noting hypodermic syringes and something called the gold cure.
Let's actually unpack the gold cure, because this is just wild historical context.
It completely blew my mind when I researched it. The gold cure, or the Keeley cure, was developed by a Dr. Leslie Keeley in the late 1800s.
It was a massive commercial enterprise.
Huge, heavily franchised.
Yeah.
And patients were literally injected with gold salts, specifically gold chloride. It was marketed as this absolute miracle cure for alcoholism.
The theory Keeley promoted was that alcoholism was a disease, which, to be fair, was actually progressive for the time. But his proposed mechanism was total pseudoscience.
He claimed the gold salts would essentially rebuild the nerve cells, right?
Yeah, and magically remove the craving for alcohol. But in reality, the injections often contained a mixture of gold chloride, along with hidden ingredients like strychnine, alcohol, apomorphine, or even morphine.
Wait. They were injecting alcoholics with morphine and strychnine to cure them of drinking.
Frequently, yes.
That is insane.
It really is. The strychnine was meant to act as a stimulant, and the apomorphine would induce severe nausea if they drank, so it was acting as an early form of aversion therapy.
But the core gold element was largely a placebo at best, and actively toxic at worst.
Exactly. The patients were essentially participating in a highly regimented communal drying out process that was disguised as a medical breakthrough.
It just highlights how completely helpless the medical establishment was. They were throwing expensive heavy metals and poisons at a complex biopsychosocial disorder.
And it completely failed Mel.
Right. He was so deeply entrenched in the disease that he took his entire expensive medical treatment outfit, the syringes, the supposed cures, and sold them for 3 whiskeys in a matter of minutes.
He sold the very mechanism of his supposed salvation for another hour of oblivion.
He even sold his own shoes. Which brings us to the absolute darkest sequence in the biography. And this is a sequence that is genuinely difficult to process.
It's heartbreaking.
Mel goes on a massive 10-day bender. He completely abandons his home. And during those 10 days, his only child, a 2-year-old son, dies.
The historical record doesn't specify the exact cause of the child's death, which was sadly common in the era of high infant mortality. But the timing is just the catastrophic element here.
It's unthinkable. Mel eventually staggers back to his cold, bare house, and he walks in to find his wife, Lottie, holding the lifeless body of their baby in her arms.
Just a horrific scene to walk into.
I try to put myself in Lottie's position. Your husband has been missing for a week and a half, liquidating your assets for alcohol. Your child dies in a freezing house.
When Mel walks through that door, you would expect absolute fury.
You would expect her to scream, to attack him, to throw him out, but her reaction is stunningly different. The biography states she gently laid the baby on the bed, fell to her knees, and completely surrendered her life to God.
She prayed right there in the room with him.
Yeah, acknowledging that God was literally all she had left in the world.
It is a moment of profound psychological break for both of them, but manifesting in opposite directions. Lottie experiences a total ego surrender, leading to spiritual reliance.
She hits absolute rock bottom and looks up.
While Mel hits absolute rock bottom and decides to start digging, he is entirely overwhelmed by shame, self-disgust, and the absolute horror of his complicity.
If not in the death itself, then in his absence during it.
Exactly. And this is where we have to look at the mechanics of human despair. How does a man reach a point where he witnesses his wife holding their dead child, hears her desperate prayer, and his response is to just turn around and abandon her entirely?
He just walks out. He ends up riding the train rods, becoming a denizen of the city jungles, resorting to burglary just to get whiskey money. At what point does the human mind switch from seeking a good time to accepting that level of total depravity? How does the brain justify missing your own child's death?
It doesn't justify it, really. It simply short circuits. We have to look at the hierarchy of needs in a brain hijacked by late-stage severe chemical dependency.
Right, because the substance isn't fun anymore.
No, the substance no longer provides pleasure at all. It has usurped the brain's primary survival drive. It literally overrides parental instinct, social bonding, physical safety, and moral reasoning.
So the shame he felt in that room.
The shame Mel felt was likely so psychologically agonizing, so entirely unbearable, that his conscious mind could not process it without fracturing completely.
So the only coping mechanism his brain had left was to obliterate his consciousness entirely with more alcohol.
Exactly. He didn't abandon his family out of malice or a lack of care. He abandoned them because the pain of caring was a fatal threat to his psyche, and the alcohol offered the only anesthetic.
So his descent isn't a gradual fade out into the sunset. It is a high-speed, violent crash into a brick wall. He is running from the ghost of his dead child, running from his wife's prayer, and running from his own reflection.
And to survive, he essentially becomes a ghost himself. He engages in what the era called riding the rods.
For you listening, if you aren't familiar with this term, riding the rods meant illegally traveling on trains by literally clinging to the truss rods underneath the freight cars.
It was incredibly dangerous.
You are inches away from the rushing tracks, covered in soot, risking death if you slip or fall asleep. It is the absolute, literal underbelly of American society.
And this brutal existence inevitably funnels him to the lowest point of gravity in the Midwest, which was Skid Row in Chicago.
Which brings us precisely back to where we started, January 19, 1897. The freezing night outside the Clark Street Saloon. The missing obituary.
He's 27 years old, and he's walking toward Lake Michigan to drown himself.
Let's break down the mechanics of the intervention that saves his life here, because it's not a gentle clinical process at all.
Not even slightly.
As Mel is slouching toward the dark waters of the lake, a man named Tom Mackey intervenes. And Tom Mackey is a fascinating figure in his own right.
He was an ex-jockey, right?
Yeah, an ex-jockey, a guy who really knows the rough side of life, who is now working for a local rescue mission. Mackey is standing out in the freezing cold. He's tired. He's fighting the urge to go inside where it's warm. But he spots Mel.
And Mackey doesn't approach him with a clipboard. He doesn't hand him a pamphlet about the dangers of alcohol.
No. He physically intercepts him. The biography says Mackey literally grabs Mel and pushes him through the doors of the Pacific Garden Mission.
The physicality of that moment is so crucial to understand. Grassroots rescue work in the 19th century wasn't about polite invitations. It was an aggressive disruption of the trajectory of death.
Because Mackey recognized the signs.
He saw the lack of shoes, the purposeful stagger toward the lake. He recognized a man who had zero agency left. So Mackey substituted his own agency.
He shoved Mel through those doors and pushed him into a chair right by the chimney, which was the warmest spot in the room.
And that sudden change in temperature, combined with the alcohol and exhaustion, causes Mel to instantly pass out.
So Mel is unconscious, dead to the world. And up on the platform of the mission, the superintendent, a man named Harry Monroe, is preaching.
Monroe is also a former booze fighter who had been saved at that very mission years earlier, so he knows the crowd he's talking to.
And here's where we get a moment of timing that defies mathematical probability. Mel is asleep, but he wakes up at the exact, precise microsecond that Harry Monroe speaks one specific sentence.
Monroe says, "I was 27 years old when I wandered into this mission."
And Mel Trotter, sitting there shivering by the chimney, is also exactly 27 years old.
The sliding doors moment of history.
I picture Mel's brain in that moment like an old-school analog radio dial. You know, you're twisting the knob trying to find a station, and all you get is heavy, aggressive static.
Right, the static of his grief, the cold, the trauma.
It's just a wall of noise. Complex theology, moral lecturing, or behavioral advice would have just bounced right off that static. But then Harry Monroe hits one highly specific frequency, the number 27.
It's the exact frequency Mel's brain happens to be tuned to.
And suddenly, the static drops. The signal snaps in, crystal clear. Is it purely luck that Tom Mackey was on the street that night, or does this speak to the vital importance of showing up in the darkest places on the off chance you find someone ready to listen?
It's definitely the latter. It is the ultimate psychological key turning in the lock. That numerical coincidence localized him. It pierced the stupor.
Mel thought to himself, I'm in a mission. What was that he said? 27 years old.
It forced his brain to recognize that the man on the stage who was speaking with authority, clarity, and hope had stood in his exact same shoes at his exact same age. It instantly bridged the gap between total depravity and potential redemption.
And in that brief window of clarity, when Monroe gives the invitation for men to come forward to the altar, Mel actually raises his hand.
He stands up on his bare, freezing feet.
And he staggers down the aisle. And Harry Monroe doesn't stand behind a pulpit and pray over him from a distance. Monroe gets down on his knees right beside this dirty, disheveled, unhoused man.
He puts his arm around him, ignoring the smell and the dirt, and leads him in a prayer for salvation and mercy.
And the resulting shift in Trotter's psyche is wild.
It's what early psychologists like William James, in his seminal work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, categorized as the phenomenon of instantaneous transformation.
Because usually, recovery is a daily, agonizing battle, right?
Exactly. While many individuals in recovery struggle for decades with managing the disease step by step, there is a documented subset of cases where a profound spiritual or emotional conversion results in the complete and sudden removal of the compulsion.
And Trotter claimed exactly that. According to his own testimony, repeated 40 years later, he said the old things passed away so thoroughly that he never once wanted the things which dominated his life again.
He claimed he never touched a single drop of liquor from that minute on.
The craving was just gone. It was surgically removed.
William James theorized that this happens when an individual reaches a state of absolute self-surrender, where the ego completely collapses under the undeniable weight of its own failure.
And the religious conversion rapidly fills that sudden psychological vacuum with an entirely new identity and a new central organizing principle.
For Mel, the transformation was absolute. The biography notes that for the next 2 years, he was so consumed by his new reality that he didn't even read a newspaper. He was utterly obsessed with his faith.
He immediately wrote a letter to his mother, too. Remember the mother who taught him the prayer about the tempest?
Prayer will make the storm a calm.
Right. He wrote to her saying, "Your God has entered my soul." His brother later reported that when his mother read that letter, she fell to the floor in tears, crying, "Thank God, I knew he would come to Jesus."
It's the ultimate vindication of her patient endurance.
And Mel's life stabilizes rapidly after this. He becomes known around the mission as the man who raved about Jesus. He gets a legitimate job as a barber again.
He sends for his wife Lottie, they reunite, and they secure a small room, experiencing actual peace for the first time in their marriage.
But this is the pivot point of the biography, because if the story ended right here, it would just be a beautiful, heartwarming tale of personal recovery.
But Mel doesn't just settle down in a quiet suburb and live out his days in peaceful obscurity.
Not at all. He takes his dark past, his trauma, and his intimate knowledge of the underworld, and he completely weaponizes it. He turns around and walks straight back into the fire to pull other people out.
Which initiates the next massive phase of his life. 3 years after his conversion in Chicago, an urgent appeal comes from a group of businessmen a few hours away in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
These are wealthy, civic-minded men who want to help the outcasts in their city.
But they recognize they lack the street credibility to do it themselves. They need a specialist. They need someone who speaks the language. So on February 24th, 1900, Mel Trotter answers the call and opens a mission at 95 Canal Street in Grand Rapids.
And the location he chooses for this mission is a masterclass in strategic audacity. He doesn't set up shop in the nice part of town.
No, he plants his flag directly on the border of a district known locally as Bucktown and the Market Street District.
The biography's description of Bucktown is so visceral. It refers to it as a slough of despair, a literal Dante's hell.
To fully grasp the environment Trotter was walking into, we have to understand the urban slums of the American Midwest in 1900. This was the era of the lumber boom in Michigan.
So Grand Rapids was a rapidly expanding industrial hub.
Right. But it was a city without modern zoning laws, without organized public housing, and without a robust social safety net. Bucktown was the unregulated, segregated red light district.
It was an area characterized by rampant vice operating out in the open. The book describes muddy streets, horse cars rattling by, and dilapidated houses that had been physically dragged from respectable parts of town and dumped along the riverfront to serve as brothels, gambling dens, and cheap saloons.
This is where the lumberjacks came to blow their season's pay in a weekend. It's where the chronic alcoholics, the criminals, and the exploited lived.
And the cast of characters operating in Bucktown sounds like something out of a Dickens novel mixed with a wild western.
The local figures wielded immense unchecked power. The biography highlights individuals like Yellow Liz.
Oh, man.
It was a notorious local madam, described as having an acorn-sized wart on her forehead and woolly whiskers on her chin.
And her husband was currently serving time in prison for a murderous assault.
Exactly. Her establishment was so infamous that wealthy people from the uptown respectable districts would actually go slumming. They would hire carriages to drive through Bucktown just to gawk at her house as if it were an exhibit in a macabre zoo.
And then you had Dave Beach, a horse trader who was known universally as the mayor of Bucktown. Beach wasn't an elected official. He was a political boss.
His establishment served as the headquarters for every tough, every criminal, and every hustler in town.
He essentially controlled the local voting bloc, which meant the police and the politicians largely left him alone. He was the apex predator of the district.
And this was the exact ecosystem Mel Trotter decided to invade.
The choice of the word invade is highly appropriate because the traditional charity model of the late 19th and early 20th century was largely based on extraction and performance.
Traditional charities often operated in safe, respectable areas. They required the marginalized person to summon the willpower to leave their environment, travel across town, clean themselves up, and essentially perform contrition for the upper classes in order to receive a meal or a bed.
Mel Trotter inverted that entire power dynamic. He brought the sanctuary directly into the heart of the darkness. He shared a physical wall with the saloons.
But I know you have some thoughts on the methodology here from a modern recovery standpoint.
Yeah, I have to challenge this because today, someone gets sober, the absolute first rule of recovery is protect your environment. Identify your triggers and avoid them.
People change their phone numbers, cut ties with old friends.
They avoid the physical locations where they used to use. Isn't taking a newly sober addict, a guy who used to ride the rods and burglarize houses for whiskey money, and placing him permanently in the Dante's hell of Bucktown, the equivalent of sending a recovering pyromaniac to work full-time in a fireworks factory?
It's a highly valid critique. By today's clinical standards, it would be considered incredibly reckless.
How was he not terrified of relapsing? How did he survive the constant sensory assault of his old life?
Trotter's survival and his unprecedented success came down to a fundamental shift in his identity. He no longer viewed himself as a victim of the slum. He viewed himself as its conqueror.
Wow, so the environment wasn't a threat anymore.
No, his previous environment was no longer a temptation. It was his designated battlefield. And more importantly, he survived because he possessed what the biographer brilliantly terms the language of the jungle.
Language of the jungle. I love that concept so much.
It was his ultimate tactical advantage. Those wealthy businessmen who funded the mission could never have reached the denizens of Bucktown because they didn't speak the language.
They approached the poor with pity or clinical distance.
But Trotter approached them with an unassailable, lived authenticity. He commanded immediate respect from the outcast because the moment he opened his mouth, they recognized one of their own.
You couldn't con Mel Trotter. It was impossible. He had been the ultimate con man. He knew every hustle, every sob story, every manipulation they were going to try before they even formulated the thought.
If a guy stumbled into the mission crying, asking for 20 cents for a hot meal, Trotter knew exactly how that 20 cents was going to be spent at the saloon next door.
But here is the genius of Trotter. He also knew exactly how much physical and psychological pain that guy was in because he possessed the exact same scars.
His empathy was rooted in shared trauma, not theoretical compassion. He would often give them the money they asked for, but he would extract a blood oath promise that they would show up at the mission meeting that night.
He used his past not as a source of quiet shame to be hidden away, but as his primary credential. He weaponized his own failures to build trust.
And that strategy proved devastatingly effective. He didn't just survive in Bucktown, he dominated it.
He started seeing massive conversions, including notorious figures like Dave Beach, the mayor of Bucktown himself,
whose transformation shocked the entire city. Trotter proved he wasn't just a guy with a lucky recovery story. He was a highly capable executive.
He was a visionary disguised as a plain, everyday human being. And this is where the scale of his impact explodes, moving him from a local hero to a national powerhouse.
Yes, the sheer scale of his administrative and organizational achievement over the ensuing decades is staggering.
For the first 20 years after his conversion, he focused intensely on building up the Grand Rapids mission, perfecting his system of urban rescue.
But he realized the model was scalable. He eventually went on to found 67 distinct rescue missions across the United States.
And beyond founding those, he personally raised the operational budgets for 100 more missions.
The financial discipline he exhibited is perhaps the most unbelievable part of this entire biography.
It really is. The book explicitly notes that his own flagship mission in Grand Rapids never ran a deficit in 40 years.
40 years. That span covers World War I, the massive economic fluctuations of the Roaring '20s, and the absolute devastation of the Great Depression.
Through all of that, a charity offering free food, clothing, and shelter to the poorest of the poor never once ended a year in the red.
It requires a level of fiscal genius that is rarely found in visionary leaders.
Exactly. If we look at the modern business world, finding an EC founder who is simultaneously the wildly charismatic visionary, the best coder on the team, and the most ruthlessly disciplined fiscal CEO is a unicorn.
It almost never happens.
Usually the charismatic visionary bankrupts the company chasing wild ideas, or the fiscal bean counter suffocates the vision by refusing to take risks. Mel Trotter was the unicorn.
He combined the spiritual fervor and stage presence of the famous evangelist D.L. Moody, the folksy, disarming humor of Will Rogers, and the spreadsheet discipline of a Wall Street banker.
Where staff recognized this dual nature. Right?
Yeah, they affectionately but seriously refer to him as the boss. He ran a very tight ship, and his philosophy of recovery was fiercely practical. Emotional religious experiences were fine, but he demanded behavioral evidence.
There's that deeply revealing anecdote in the biography about a local man named Bob Ingersoll.
Not the famous agnostic orator, but a local Grand Rapids man who shared the name.
Right. Ingersoll was converted at the mission, experiencing a profound emotional release. But immediately after Bob is saved, Mel Trotter pulls him aside and demands to know exactly how Bob plans to pay off all the debts he owes to the various merchants and tailors in the city.
I find that so refreshing. Trotter valued practical restitution over performative piety.
He didn't just want you crying at the altar. He wanted you paying back your grocer. He wanted functional, responsible citizens. He understood that true recovery meant taking responsibility for the wreckage of your past.
And managing this ever-expanding network of missions, dealing with thousands of difficult, broken people, required a highly specific leadership philosophy.
Trotter had to learn how to manage his own frustrations early on.
Early in his tenure in Grand Rapids, he was struggling with the crowds. The younger folks who came into the mission were often disorderly, laughing during the sermons, mocking the workers, and intentionally disrupting the meetings.
Trotter, with his street brawler background, was losing his temper and constantly trying to forcefully impose order.
And this leads to one of my favorite metaphors in the entire book. Dave Beach, the converted mayor of Bucktown, and an older, wiser mission worker named Dan pull Mel aside to give him some advice.
They use a horse training analogy, which was perfect given Mel's history at the racetracks.
Dan tells him, when a horse stops to kick, he ain't pulling. The procession's going on, and you are loosing ground every time you get to kicking.
Dan goes on to explain that if a young colt goes crooked when you're trying to break it straight, it means its heart is wrong.
And you can't force a heart to change through discipline alone. Only power and strength, or in their theological framework, only God can change the internal disposition.
Dan's ultimate conclusion was that Mel needed to stop halting the wagon to fight every distraction. He said, he ain't a pacer, he's a trotter.
It's brilliant. Dan is telling him, you are the engine. Your job is to keep pulling the wagon forward.
Leaders lose all their forward momentum when they stop the race to kick back at the critics in the grandstands, or to fight every uncooperative subordinate, or to address every petty grievance.
Trotter internalized that lesson. He stopped stopping. He just kept pulling. And he pulled that wagon across the globe. He became one of the most in-demand speakers and evangelists of his era.
His influence during World War I highlights how universally respected he had become. He worked tirelessly in the military camps, particularly at Camp Merritt in New Jersey, which was a major embarkation camp for soldiers heading to the trenches in Europe.
The military draft board actually refused to let him leave the camps. They formally declared that they couldn't afford to send him away because he was doing the greatest possible good for the morale of the soldiers.
Think about the weight of that. He was counseling thousands of young men who were quite literally going off to die. The book notes the profound confessions he heard.
One young soldier confessed to being a double murderer, terrified of facing eternity. Another was paralyzed by the bitterness of his parents' divorce back home.
Mel had this unprecedented freedom to probe their hearts because he was so disarmingly genuine. He never put on a fake ecclesiastical voice. He didn't wear fancy religious robes.
He sat with them and used the vernacular of the street, the language of the jungle. He spoke to them man to man.
And his relentless pace only accelerated after the war. He became the ultimate pinch hitter for the legendary stadium-filling evangelists of the early 20th century.
Men like Billy Sunday, Dr. R.A. Torrey, and J. Wilbur Chapman.
If Billy Sunday was running a massive campaign in a major city, preaching to 70,000 people, and he got sick or his voice gave out, they would call Mel Trotter to take the platform.
And Trotter did it seamlessly, without a trace of ego. He never tried to hijack their campaigns or steal their glory. He simply stepped into the spotlight, raved about Jesus, as he called it, and then quietly stepped back out.
But this immense output brings up a critical question about the physical toll of such a life. How did he prevent total burnout?
It's an astute observation.
When you are constantly pouring out massive amounts of emotional and spiritual energy to tens of thousands of people, constantly traveling, overseeing 67 distinct missions, raising millions of dollars, a human body is not designed to sustain that.
In fact, Billy Sunday himself recognized it. Sunday wrote Trotter a letter practically begging him to take a break.
Sunday enclosed a check and explicitly told him, use this for yourself and your wife, not for the mission. Go to Florida and rest. I am tired. You must be tired.
What fuels an engine that refuses to shut down?
Exactly.
The human body cannot sustain it indefinitely, and eventually his physical form began to give way. The fuel that drove him was an unquenchable, almost terrifying level of gratitude for his own rescue.
You have to remember his psychological baseline. He truly believed that he was supposed to be a frozen, anonymous corpse at the bottom of Lake Michigan in 1897.
Therefore, every single day, every single breath he took after that January night was viewed as borrowed time. He felt he owed a debt to grace that could never fully be repaid.
That's like survivor's guilt mixed with divine calling.
Precisely. He lived with an urgent, unquiet spirit. He viewed himself as a brand plucked from the burning, and he was determined to burn himself out in service rather than rust out in comfort.
He fought serious health battles throughout his later years, including a severe bout with cancer that he miraculously survived.
Which only seemed to fuel his urgency even more. He knew the clock was ticking.
Which, tragically, but inevitably, leads us to the final chapter of his life and the ultimate measurement of his life's work. The relentless engine finally ran out of physical fuel.
In 1937, while participating in the massive Moody Centenary Tour in Britain, Mel suffered a severe health setback.
He managed to rally for a short time, returning to the States, but his health was in a permanent, steady decline. Finally, on September 11th, 1940, at his summer home in Manitoba Park, Michigan, Melvin E. Trotter passed away at the age of 70.
The tributes that poured in upon his death were massive and came from every sector of society.
The Grand Rapids Morning Herald, the mainstream secular newspaper of the city he had invaded 40 years earlier, published a glowing editorial.
They called him a true man of God, explicitly noting that he had known the way of the transgressor, that he had wallowed in the slough of sin, and then devoted his entire subsequent existence to lifting others out of that exact same muck.
And the academic and religious worlds paid their respects as well. Dr. Bob Jones Sr., a prominent figure who had previously awarded Mel an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree, spoke at his funeral.
He delivered a eulogy that was incredibly touching in its simplicity. He said he often wished he could have been standing in heaven when Mel walked through the gates.
He imagined Mel looking around and saying, Jesus, it was wonderful of you to save me. I'm sorry I wasn't a better Christian. But Jesus, I sure do love you.
What is deeply moving about that tribute is that it captures Trotter's lifelong resistance to self-importance. Despite the honorary degrees, the international fame, the audiences of tens of thousands, and the massive organizational power he wielded, Mel Trotter maintained absolute humility.
In his own autobiography, written near the end of his life, he acknowledged the academic honors, but explicitly stated, "Yet to the gang downtown, I am still just plain Mel Trotter by the grace of God."
He never lost his primary identification with the marginalized. He was always, first and foremost, a rescued man.
And this brings us to the central thesis posed by the biographer, Fred Zarfas. At the end of the book, Zarfas asks a very direct, provocative question. Are rescue missions worthwhile?
It's a fair question. Do they actually solve the systemic problems, or are they just putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds?
Zarfas argues that Trotter's life and the thousands of lives he saved, the stomachs he fed, the families he reunited, is the definitive, undeniable yes.
If we evaluate this analytically, looking at the history of social movements, the longevity of institutions built on singular, highly charismatic personalities is usually very short.
When the dynamic founder dies, the institution often crumbles rapidly because it was fundamentally a cult of personality rather than a resilient system. The organization doesn't know how to function without the visionary.
But Zarfas points out that the Mel Trotter mission continued to thrive, expand, and balance its budgets even 10 years after Trotter's death. And indeed, the organization still exists and operates today.
That proves Trotter didn't just build a stage for his own ego. He built a robust, self-sustaining system of urban rescue. He successfully institutionalized empathy.
He built a machine that could continue pulling the wagon even after he let go of the reins.
But reviewing his life makes me wonder deeply about our societal approach today. When we look at modern urban crises, the massive unhoused populations, the fentanyl and opioid epidemics ravaging our cities right now, are we missing the Mel Trotter approach?
Have we institutionalized charity so heavily, wrapped it in so much red tape, clinical jargon, and bureaucratic policy that we've completely lost the language of the jungle that Mel brought to the table?
Have we forgotten the sheer power of just walking into Bucktown, sitting down in the muck, and speaking man-to-man with the people who are suffering?
It is an incredibly vital debate within modern social work. The professionalization of care, the clinical models, the harm reduction strategies, the psychiatric interventions, these are all necessary advancements.
We understand the brain much better than Dr. Keeley did with his gold salts.
But Trotter's legacy insists that there is a profound, irreplaceable power in the testimony of the wounded healer. The person who is currently shivering on Skid Row, caught in the grip of addiction, is fundamentally suspicious of clinical authority.
But they are much more likely to trust the outstretched hand of someone who bears their own visible scars from those exact same streets.
Trotter's life challenges modern institutions to ensure they never lose that ground-level, human-to-human connection in their pursuit of abstract policy solutions.
Because it all comes down to the incredible butterfly effect of one saved life. Think about the compounding interest of what happened in 1897.
Tom Mackey, a tired rescue worker, decides not to go inside where it's warm. He stays out in the freezing cold.
He pushes one drunk, shoeless, suicidal guy into a mission building. That one guy gets sober, opens 67 missions across the country, counsels soldiers in World War I, and touches the lives of literal millions over the next 40 years.
The compounding interest of a single aggressive act of intervention. You never know the ultimate reach of the life you pull back from the edge.
Exactly. So to summarize this unbelievable trajectory we've explored today, we've followed Mel Trotter from a freezing, suicidal man outside a Chicago saloon, drowning under the generational shadow of a bartender father, to a global force for urban rescue.
We saw the quiet, agonizing power of a mother's foundational prayer acting as a latent anchor in the storm.
We saw him leverage his darkest failures, his time riding the rods, and his profound shame into his greatest asset. He used his unassailable authenticity to invade the most dangerous slums in America and rewrite the rulebook on charity, proving that lived experience is the ultimate credential.
He was a man of extraordinary, beautiful contradictions. He was a street-smart brawler who wept openly over lost souls.
He was a fiscal genius who never cared a bit about accumulating personal wealth. He was a global celebrity who only ever wanted to be known and remembered as plain Mel Trotter.
Which brings me to a final, provocative thought for you listening today.
We talked right at the beginning about the missing obituary, the newspaper clipping from 1897 that would have written Mel Trotter off as just another ragged bum fished out of Lake Michigan, a forgotten, tragic statistic.
I want you to consider your own city right now. Think about the modern equivalents of Bucktown. The encampments, the marginalized neighborhoods, the places polite society tries to ignore.
How many potential Mel Trotters, future leaders, brilliant organizers, empathetic visionaries, and world changers are currently walking those streets? People who have been completely written off by society as hopeless, broken statistics.
What would happen if we looked at the marginalized not as problems to be managed or nuisances to be moved out of sight, but as missing obituaries waiting to be rewritten into epics?
Because if the X-ray of society just shows a broken bone, it's easy to categorize it and look away. But if you realize that behind the muddy, murky waters of addiction and despair, there is a pulse, a massive potential, a human being entirely capable of changing the world, well, you might just be compelled to reach out and pull them back from the edge of the lake.
You might just help them find their frequency.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.